fall of Rome is more than a chapter in a history book. It is a symbol, a legend, and perhaps even a warning. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome ruled as the unrivaled power of the Mediterranean world. From the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, from the wild forests of Germania to the sun-baked shores of North Africa, Roman law and order stretched across thousands of miles. Imagine standing in Rome itself at the empire's height around the 2nd century of our era. The city teems with life, over 1 million souls, a number no other European city would reach again for more than 1,000 years. Marble temples line the avenues, triumphal arches proclaim the victories of emperors, and aqueducts carry cool mountain water into public fountains and private homes. The Colosseum, the grand amphitheater of blood and spectacle, towers above the streets, while the Roman Forum hums with senators, merchants, and philosophers debating the future of the empire. To the Roman citizen, their world must have felt eternal. Rome was not just a city, but an idea, that order could be imposed upon chaos, that roads and laws could bind together dozens of nations and cultures, that the power of one city could stretch farther than Alexander's empire, farther even than the wildest dreams of its founders. Coins carried the emperor's image to the farthest frontier, and the Latin tongue became the language of administration, of command, and of pride. And yet, when we look back, we see the story told so simply. Rome was great, and then Rome fell. Barbarians crossed the frontiers, emperors grew weak, corruption spread, and one day the empire was gone. It is a tale easy to tell, but too simple to believe. For no civilization of such size vanishes overnight. Instead, we must picture a long twilight, years of slow fading, of shifting powers, of continuity as much as collapse. The idea of Rome's fall has haunted Western thought for centuries. Medieval monks saw it as a divine punishment for sin. Renaissance scholars saw it as the tragic loss of classical wisdom. Modern historians debate whether it was even a fall at all, or whether it was simply a transformation, as Rome's empire gave way to new kingdoms and cultures that carried forward its legacy. In this journey, we will not settle for the simple story. We will listen for the quiet details, the struggles of ordinary people, the anxieties of emperors, the whispers of outsiders at the borders. We will try to understand why this empire, which once seemed as solid as the stones of its aqueducts, began to shift, to weaken, and eventually to change into something new. And so, our story begins not with an ending, but with a vision of Rome in all its glory. For only by standing in the streets of the eternal city at its height can we truly appreciate what it meant for that city and its empire to one day lose its grip on the world. To understand the weight of Rome's eventual decline, we must pause for a moment and take in the astonishing scale of what Rome had achieved. Imagine the map of the Mediterranean world in the 2nd century, during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Rome's frontiers stretched farther than ever before. To the north, its legions guarded the windswept wall built by Hadrian across Britain, holding back tribes beyond the edge of the known world. To the east, Roman banners flew in the deserts of Mesopotamia, where soldiers faced the rival empire of Parthia. To the south, Rome commanded the coasts of North Africa, where ships carried grain to feed the hungry city. And at the center of it all lay the Mediterranean Sea, Mare Nostrum, our sea, a Roman lake that tied the empire together in trade, culture, and power. The machinery of empire was as impressive as its borders, roads, straight and enduring, cut across mountains and plains, linking cities and forts with astonishing efficiency. A messenger on horseback could carry news from Gaul to Italy in mere days. Merchants followed these same routes, transporting olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, glass from Syria, and spices from Arabia. Each road was also a military tool. The legions could march swiftly, their heavy boots striking in rhythm, ready to quell rebellion or repel invaders. Rome's armies were not only powerful, they were disciplined. Unlike the tribal war bands they often faced, Roman legions were professional, trained to fight as a unit, to build camps in orderly fashion, and to obey without hesitation. A single legion could be a moving city, capable of constructing fortifications, bridges, and even siege engines as they advanced. And yet, these soldiers were not faceless. They were farmers' sons from Italy, Spain, and Gaul, often serving for 20 20 years before being rewarded with land or citizenship. The empire's strength was built on the lives of men who bore its weight on their shields and in their bones. But Rome was more than soldiers and stone. It was also an empire of ideas. The law, carefully codified, spread across its provinces, ensuring that disputes could be resolved with rules rather than endless blood feuds. Latin and Greek became the twin languages of empire. Latin for law and administration, Greek for philosophy and science. In bustling cities from Antioch to Carthage, you could hear a mix of tongues, a blending of traditions that gave Rome a cosmopolitan flavor unmatched in its time. For the ordinary Roman citizen, daily life was a mixture of comfort and hardship. In Rome itself, the wealthy reclined in marble villas decorated with frescoes and mosaics, dining on exotic dishes from the empire's corners. Meanwhile, the poor crowded into insulae, tall, rickety apartment blocks prone to fire and collapse. Public baths offered a place for all classes to bathe, socialize, and relax, while circuses and amphitheaters provided endless entertainment. Gladiatorial combat, chariot races, and theatrical performances filled the days with both excitement and distraction. Bread was cheap, entertainment plentiful, and for many that was enough. To its citizens, Rome felt invincible. Even when emperors fell to assassination or civil war, the empire itself endured. When one man failed, another replaced him, and the machine rolled on. It seemed unthinkable that anything so vast, so organized, so deeply rooted could ever come to an end. And yet, within this same strength, small weaknesses were already beginning to grow, unnoticed by most, but destined to shape the empire's fate in centuries to come. If we could spend a day in the city of Rome at its height, the contrasts would strike us immediately. The grandeur of marble temples, triumphal arches, and broad avenues stood beside the narrow, crowded alleys where ordinary people lived. The scent of incense from a religious ceremony might mingle with the smoke of cooking fires and the less pleasant stench of waste thrown into the streets. Rome was magnificent, but it was also messy, a living city in every sense. For the wealthy, life was defined by luxury and display. Banquets stretched long into the evening, with couches arranged around low tables. Guests reclined as servants brought course after course, roasted meats, fish sauces, exotic fruits, and wines sweetened with honey. Conversation drifted from politics to philosophy, from gossip about the emperor to speculation about the future. The villa itself was a statement of wealth. Decorated walls, private gardens, and fountains that sang with the constant flow of aqueduct water. Yet most Romans lived far more humbly. Families crowded into multi-story tenement blocks with thin wooden walls and little space for privacy. Fires were frequent, and collapse was always a risk. These people depended on the grain dole, free distributions of wheat, imported largely from Egypt, and on the entertainments provided in arenas and circuses. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captured this reality. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they would remain content. It was a formula that worked, but one that also revealed how fragile the balance of society could be. The Roman economy was immense, but not always stable. Gold and silver poured into the empire from conquered lands, but as expansion slowed, wealth had to be drawn from within. Heavy taxation pressed on the provinces, and while trade flourished along the roads and sea lanes, much of this prosperity depended on slaves captured in wars. In times of peace, the supply of new slaves slowed, and with it, the economic engine began to strain. Still, these problems seemed far away in Rome's golden age. Most citizens saw only the bounty of empire, bustling markets filled with goods from distant lands, temples shining with offerings to the gods, and endless entertainments that gave the illusion of eternal stability. Rome had weathered civil wars before. It had faced rebellions, invasions, even disasters like the Great Fire under Nero, and each time it had survived. The Romans called their city the Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city, and to live there was to believe in its immortality. Yet history whispers in the small details. Behind the glitter of festivals and the roar of the Colosseum, some sense that change was underway. The empire's borders, though vast, were not limitless, and its armies were stretched thin. Local cultures absorbed Roman ways, but they also transformed them, creating a patchwork of identities beneath the imperial banner. And within the Senate and palace walls, politics was rarely stable, with rival factions scheming for power. For now, Rome stood tall, its empire stretching farther than any before it. But the cracks were there, faint but real, the kind of cracks that, over centuries, can turn marble into dust. The Romans had a phrase that captured their belief in permanence: Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. To them, the city was not just the capital of an empire, but the very heart of the world. Its laws, its gods, its customs seemed destined to endure as long as time itself. For centuries, this confidence was reinforced again and again. Whenever Rome faced disaster, it rose again. There had been moments in the past when Rome seemed on the edge of ruin. In the 4th century before Christ, the city was sacked by Gauls, its walls breached and its citizens humiliated. But Rome rebuilt, stronger than before. During the Punic Wars, Hannibal of Carthage marched his elephants across the Alps and threatened the very gates of the city. Yet Rome endured, and in the end, Carthage was destroyed. Even in the chaos of the late Republic, when civil war tore the city apart, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon and rival generals fought for power, Rome did not collapse. Instead, it was transformed into an empire under Augustus, more powerful and more organized than ever. This long memory gave the Romans a sense of destiny. They believed their city had a divine mission, favored by the gods. And even when Christianity replaced the old religions, that sense of inevitability remained. Writers praised Rome as the light of the world, the bringer of order and civilization. To suggest that Rome itself could fall was almost unthinkable. And yet, beneath this confidence lay hidden weaknesses. The empire had grown vast, perhaps too vast. The frontiers stretched across thousands of miles, demanding soldiers, supplies, and endless resources to defend. Communication, though faster than in most ancient societies, was still slow compared to the size of the realm. A crisis on the Rhine or the Euphrates could take weeks, even months, before news reached the capital. By then, events might already be out of control. The Roman political system, too, carried within it the seeds of instability. Emperors wielded immense power, but few had secure successions. When an emperor died, the throne might pass peacefully, or it might be seized by a general, sparking civil war. Assassinations were common, and many rulers lived in constant fear of betrayal. This cycle of uncertainty kept the empire alive, but also weakened it, for each crisis drained resources and eroded trust. For the ordinary citizen, however, these cracks were invisible. To live in Rome was to be surrounded by grandeur. To serve in the legions was to be part of an unbroken tradition of victory. To farm in the provinces was to rely on Roman roads and markets that gave stability. The empire's problems were subtle, unfolding slowly, like shadows lengthening at sunset. It is here that we must pause and reflect. Civilizations rarely notice their decline as it begins. For those within, the world feels stable, even eternal. Only later, looking back, do we see the turning points, the warning signs missed. And so it was with Rome. Its people believed in its eternity, and perhaps that belief itself delayed the recognition of the troubles ahead. The relationship between Rome and the so-called barbarian tribes was complex, filled with a mixture of fear, trade, and uneasy alliances. These tribes were often misunderstood by contemporary Romans, labeled as savage or uncivilized, yet in reality they had rich cultures, sophisticated social structures, and their own ambitions. The northern forests and plains of Europe were home to peoples who had lived in harmony with their lands for centuries. They hunted, farmed, traded, and raided, not out of sheer malice, but as part of a way of life honed over generations. For Rome, these tribes were both a threat and an opportunity. The empire recruited thousands of soldiers from their ranks, integrating them into legions far from their homelands. In return, some tribes benefited from the wealth and goods of the empire, enjoying luxuries that were rare in their own lands. Yet this relationship was precarious. Loyalty was conditional and fragile. When Rome weakened or overextended itself, these groups could turn from allies to enemies in an instant. The pressures on the empire's borders were not always violent, but they were constant. Roman governors and generals had to respond to rumors of unrest, small-scale raids, or migrations caused by famine or drought. A single neglected warning could escalate into a full-scale incursion. Rome's soldiers, far from the comfort of home, had to enforce the empire's will over unfamiliar terrain against people who knew the land far better than any legionnaire. Even the best trained troops struggled to maintain control over thousands of miles of frontier. Yet in the heart of the empire, in Rome itself and the great provincial cities, life seemed untouched by these distant troubles. Markets overflowed with goods, theaters and amphitheaters remained crowded with spectators, and civic rituals continued as they always had. It was this contrast between the bustling, seemingly eternal center and the restless, unpredictable edges that defined the late empire. The cracks were hidden, invisible to most, but they shaped the decisions of emperors, generals, and ordinary citizens alike. Rome's strength was undeniable, but it was no longer absolute. Every border skirmish, every political assassination, every economic strain, these small pressures were interconnected like tiny threads in a vast tapestry. Alone, each might seem insignificant. Together, they formed a web that would, over centuries, pull the empire in directions no one in the forum or palace could have predicted. History often remembers the grand invasions, the Gothic sack of Rome, the crossing of the Rhine, but the real story begins long before the gates fell. It begins in these quiet, almost imperceptible moments. The legionary marching for weeks, the governor negotiating with a wary tribe, the farmer struggling to feed his family while taxes climb. These are the seeds of transformation, the gentle forces that gradually reshape the face of the Roman world. Even as Rome's borders faced constant pressures, another, quieter challenge was brewing within its walls: the instability of political leadership. The empire was vast, and its machinery required strong, competent, and consistent governance to function. Yet history shows that the role of emperor was as much a source of strength as a potential vulnerability. Succession in Rome was rarely straightforward. Unlike a hereditary monarchy with clear rules, the imperial office often depended on the ambitions of generals, the loyalty of the army, and the judgment of the Senate. An emperor might designate an heir, but the declaration did not guarantee acceptance. Assassinations, coups, and civil wars punctuated Roman history, each episode draining resources, shaking public confidence, and diverting attention from the empire's long-term needs. Some emperors were extraordinary. Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius managed to combine military skill, administrative acumen, and public approval to strengthen the empire. Others, however, were weak, cruel, or indecisive, leaving the state vulnerable to corruption, intrigue, and mismanagement. A string of such rulers could erode the authority of the throne itself, creating a perception that power was fleeting and fragile. This instability affected not only politics, but the daily lives of citizens. When civil war erupted, soldiers were called from the frontiers to fight in the streets of Rome or in distant provinces, leaving borders thinly defended. Taxes often rose to pay for campaigns, provoking unrest in towns and villages. Local governors, entrusted with vast responsibilities, sometimes pursued personal gain over public duty, further weakening the cohesion of imperial administration. The Senate, once a powerful institution in the Republic, had become a shadow of its former self. Its debates, ceremonies, and decisions mattered little compared to the whims of the emperor or the ambitions of generals. This concentration of power at the top meant that the empire's fate rested on a few individuals. When those few failed, the consequences rippled outward, affecting millions of people and thousands of miles of territory. Yet despite these challenges, Rome endured. The institutions, traditions, and resilience of the city and its people allowed the empire to survive decades, even centuries, of political turmoil. This endurance created a sense of invincibility among Romans. They had survived disasters before, and so they believed they could survive again. But in truth, each crisis, each flawed ruler, each minor rebellion added another thread to the web of strain, slowly tightening the noose around an empire that, outwardly, still seemed eternal. Rome's political instability was subtle, gradual, and often invisible to those who lived through it. Unlike the dramatic sack of a city or the crossing of a barbarian army, these internal weaknesses worked quietly, day by day, shaping the destiny of an empire without anyone realizing it. Beyond the armies, beyond the politics, the empire faced pressures that touched nearly every citizen: economic strain and social division. Rome's vast territories required enormous resources to maintain. Roads, aqueducts, fortifications, and legions all demanded wealth that had to come from the provinces. Taxes were levied in grain, coin, and labor. For the peasant farmers who tilled the land from sunrise to sunset, these demands could feel crushing. A poor harvest, an unexpected levy, or a local corruption could tip a family into destitution. Urban centers, too, were vulnerable. Markets depended on the steady flow of goods from distant lands. Shipments of grain from Egypt and North Africa fed millions of Romans. When storms or pirates disrupted these supplies, famine and unrest were never far behind. The government tried to mitigate these crises with public distributions of bread and entertainment, but these measures were temporary, like patching a worn road instead of rebuilding it. The city appeared vibrant, but beneath the surface, anxiety simmered. Social divisions deepened over time. The gap between rich and poor became a defining feature of Roman life. Senators and wealthy landowners lived in villas adorned with frescoes and mosaics, while ordinary citizens crowded into insulae, precarious apartment blocks prone to fire and collapse. Slaves and freedmen provided the labor that sustained the wealth of the elite, yet they had little agency, and their discontent could be a source of instability. In some provinces, the disparity between the local population and Roman officials created resentment that could flare into rebellion. The economy itself was under strain. Rome's reliance on conquest for wealth had limits. As expansion slowed, so did the influx of plunder and new slaves. Inflation and debasement of currency weakened trade. Provinces struggled to meet tax demands while sustaining local economies. The empire's success in maintaining infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, walls, required funds that were increasingly difficult to secure. Rome's brilliance in administration could not fully offset the mounting pressures of scale, distance, and complexity. Yet, from the perspective of a citizen in the city, these troubles were often invisible. The public baths still flowed, the theaters still rang with laughter, and circuses drew enormous crowds. Festivals celebrated gods and emperors alike. The empire's magnificence remained visible, but beneath that surface, the slow grinding of economic and social pressures continued, shaping the fate of Rome in ways that the casual observer might never perceive. It is this interplay between wealth and strain, prosperity and inequality, that adds depth to the story of Rome's eventual transformation. The empire's outward beauty and power could not mask the subtle stresses within its foundation, stresses that, combined with political instability, military pressure, and cultural change, would gradually reshape the destiny of the Eternal City. As the internal pressures of Rome quietly accumulated, the world beyond its borders began to shift as well. Tribes that had once been content to trade with the empire or to serve within its legions now moved in larger, more organized groups. The Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and other Germanic peoples began to migrate across Europe, driven by a combination of population growth, climate shifts, and pressure from other nomadic groups. These movements were gradual, subtle at first, yet they carried profound consequences for the empire. For the Romans, these migrations were initially managed through diplomacy and negotiation. Treaties were drawn, alliances formed, and some tribes were even allowed to settle within imperial borders under specific conditions. Roman generals saw these arrangements as a way to reinforce the frontiers without costly campaigns. Yet the presence of large groups of outsiders within the empire created tension. Resources had to be shared, local populations sometimes resisted, and loyalty was not guaranteed. Occasionally, these relationships turned violent. When local officials abused their authority or failed to honor agreements, raids could escalate into full-scale confrontations. The Gothic War of the late 4th century was one such moment when Rome struggled to contain the Visigoths under Alaric. The empire's legions, stretched across a vast territory and weakened by years of political turmoil, found themselves facing a foe that was both skilled and determined. Though Rome survived these conflicts, each encounter revealed vulnerabilities that had long been hidden beneath the city's marble facade. Meanwhile, other tribes, like the Vandals, pushed into North Africa, targeting regions crucial for the empire's grain supply. These movements were not always sudden or dramatic. They unfolded over years, a slow, persistent pressure that strained Rome's military and administrative capabilities. The empire's response often lagged, hampered by internal disputes, delayed communications, and a reliance on armies composed increasingly of mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. From the perspective of ordinary Romans, life continued much as it always had. Markets remained busy, temples were attended, and public spectacles entertained the population. Yet for historians looking back, it is clear that these early migrations were more than minor disturbances. They were a signal of a world in flux, one in which Rome could no longer rely solely on its historical strength or reputation. The empire that had once seemed untouchable now faced challenges that were not only military, but cultural, economic, and demographic. It is here, in this delicate balance between internal strain and external pressure, that the story of Rome's transformation truly begins. The empire's endurance was remarkable, yet even the mightiest structures must contend with change. And as we move forward through this tale, we will see how these slow, cumulative pressures eventually reshaped the Roman world in ways that few of its citizens could have imagined. By the 3rd century CE, the pressures that had been slowly building for centuries began to converge in a period historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century. This era, spanning roughly from 235 to 284 CE, was marked by near constant turmoil. Political instability, economic decline, external threats, and social upheaval. It was a time when the empire's resilience was tested as never before. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency. Military commanders, often proclaimed emperor by their troops, competed for power in a series of civil wars. In a little over 50 years, Rome saw more than 20 emperors ascend the throne, many of them meeting violent ends. This rapid turnover eroded confidence in leadership and left provinces uncertain about who truly commanded authority. Governance became fragmented, with regional leaders acting independently to maintain stability in their own territories. Economically, the empire faltered. Inflation ran rampant as emperors debased currency to pay soldiers, undermining trade and everyday life. Agriculture, still the backbone of Rome's economy, suffered from overtaxation, soil depletion, and occasional invasions. Trade routes, though once marvels of organization, were increasingly threatened by piracy and banditry. Cities that had depended on steady imports of grain and other essentials faced scarcity, leading to unrest among the urban population. The military, stretched thinner than ever, faced challenges on multiple fronts. Germanic tribes pressed along the northern borders, Sasanian forces advanced from the east, and internal rebellions occasionally erupted in provinces far from the capital. The legions were forced into constant mobilization, leaving garrisons undermanned and roads less secure. At the same time, the composition of the army was changing, with a growing reliance on mercenaries whose loyalty was often uncertain. The traditional cohesion and discipline of Roman forces, once the envy of the world, was increasingly fragile. Yet despite these crises, Rome endured. Cities continued to function, temples were maintained, and life carried on in ways that suggest a remarkable capacity for adaptation. The empire's infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, walls, remained largely intact, supporting both commerce and defense. And although the central authority appeared weakened, local governments often filled gaps, maintaining order and continuity. This period illustrates a crucial truth about Rome. It did not fall overnight. Instead, the empire endured, sometimes barely, through a combination of resilience and improvisation. The crisis of the 3rd century was not the end, but a harbinger, a demonstration that Rome could be shaken, that cracks in its foundations could widen under sustained pressure. In many ways, it was a turning point, revealing the vulnerabilities that would shape the centuries to come. Amid this turmoil, a figure emerged who sought to impose order on chaos. Diocletian, ascending to the throne in 284 CE, he recognized that Rome's sprawling empire could no longer be governed from a single center. To address this, he introduced a series of reforms that reshaped imperial administration, dividing authority among multiple rulers in what became known as the Tetrarchy. By placing co-emperors and subordinate leaders in key regions, Diocletian hoped to respond more swiftly to crises on distant frontiers. Economic reforms accompanied these administrative changes. Prices were regulated, taxation was standardized, and attempts were made to stabilize currency, though such measures met with mixed success. Military organization was strengthened, with fortified borders and mobile units prepared to counter incursions before they could spread. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire faced not only military and economic challenges, but profound cultural and religious transformations. Constantine the Great emerged as a pivotal figure in this period, reshaping the empire in ways that would resonate for centuries. His reign marked the beginning of a shift that blended politics, faith, and identity in unprecedented ways. Constantine's embrace of Christianity fundamentally altered Rome's spiritual landscape. Once persecuted, Christians were now elevated, their faith intertwined with the authority of the emperor. This change did more than grant protection to a previously marginalized community. It redefined the cultural cohesion of the empire. Religion became a tool of unity, a shared identity that could reach across diverse populations and distant provinces. At the same time, it created new tensions with traditional pagan institutions, temples, and rituals whose influence gradually waned. Politically, Constantine also recognized the logistical challenges of ruling a vast empire. He shifted the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, later called Constantinople, strategically located to respond to both eastern and northern threats. This new center of power symbolized a duality within the empire. Rome remained the historic heart, but Constantinople became the operational and symbolic hub of imperial authority. Militarily, Constantine restructured the army, creating mobile units capable of rapid response while maintaining fortified borders. Economically, he introduced reforms to stabilize currency and control inflation, though the empire's vast scale made complete success impossible. In this era, the Roman world became increasingly complex. External threats continued, internal divisions persisted, and yet the empire displayed remarkable adaptability. Constantine's reforms, religious policies, and new capital offered temporary stability, demonstrating that Rome could endure transformation while preserving its core identity. But as history would soon reveal, adaptability alone was not enough to halt the long arc of change that would eventually reshape the Roman world forever. Following Constantine's reign, the Roman Empire faced a new structural transformation, division. To better manage its vast territories, the empire was increasingly administered as two halves, East and West. This division, formalized later under Theodosius, allowed for more responsive governance, but it also created new vulnerabilities. The East, with its wealthier cities and stronger defenses, could weather crises more effectively, while the West, burdened by less robust economies and more exposed frontiers, struggled to maintain stability. Meanwhile, barbarian migrations intensified. Groups such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns moved across Europe, often fleeing from other tribes or seeking fertile lands within the empire. Initially, these movements were met with diplomacy, alliances, and settlements within Roman borders. Yet as the Western Empire weakened, these groups increasingly tested its defenses, sometimes clashing violently with Roman legions. The western provinces bore the brunt of this pressure. Cities like Gaul, Hispania, and Italy faced raids, while local governors juggled limited resources and stretched military forces. The population experienced both disruption and integration. Some newcomers became allies or soldiers, others posed existential threats to towns and farmlands. Culturally, these migrations contributed to a slow blending of peoples. Roman law and customs coexisted uneasily with tribal traditions, creating hybrid societies that challenged the old imperial identity. Economically, the strain of feeding cities and armies persisted, and politically, leadership in the West became increasingly precarious. In essence, the empire was entering a phase where internal weakness and external pressure intersected. The division of East and West, once a pragmatic solution, highlighted disparities that would influence the fate of Rome for centuries. The Western Empire faced mounting challenges, while the East would endure longer, setting the stage for the ultimate transformation of the Roman world. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former grandeur. The city of Rome, once the unchallenged heart of a vast dominion, now faced threats both internal and external that no emperor could fully control. The pressures that had simmered for centuries, political instability, economic strain, social inequality, and military overextension, were now compounded by relentless migrations and invasions by tribes such as the Visigoths, Vandals, Vandals, and Huns. These forces were no longer peripheral annoyances. They had become central actors in the drama of empire, capable of shaping history in decisive ways. One of the most iconic moments of this period was the sack of Rome by the Visigothic king Alaric in 410 CE. This event shocked the ancient world. For centuries, Rome had been viewed as invincible, a city whose walls and legions had withstood countless sieges. Alaric's forces, however, penetrated the city's defenses, looting treasures, burning public buildings, and leaving an indelible mark on the Roman imagination. The sack did not represent the immediate end of the empire. Rome remained the seat of political authority, and the Western emperors continued to rule in name, but it symbolized a profound shift. The city that had once epitomized power and permanence was vulnerable, and the myth of Rome's eternity had been irrevocably shaken. The reasons for this vulnerability were manifold. Politically, the Western Empire suffered from a fractured leadership structure. Emperors were often young, inexperienced, or puppets of powerful generals. Rivalries between factions, combined with the pressures of succession, frequently led to civil war. In the decades leading up to Alaric's sack, emperors were deposed, assassinated, or overthrown with alarming regularity. Each regime change disrupted governance, diverted resources from defense and infrastructure, and eroded public confidence. By contrast, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintained a more stable administration and better protected borders, which allowed it to endure for centuries longer. Economically, the Western Empire was under tremendous strain. Agriculture remained the backbone of Roman prosperity, yet overtaxation, soil depletion, and repeated invasions undermined productivity. Cities depended on imported grain, often from North Africa, and disruptions in these supply chains could precipitate famine and unrest. Coinage had been repeatedly debased to fund military campaigns, causing inflation and undermining trade. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, leaving the majority of citizens vulnerable to poverty and marginalization. Social divisions deepened, with growing resentment toward the elite, who were often insulated from the hardships experienced by commoners. Military challenges compounded these issues. The Western legions were overstretched and increasingly reliant on federated troops from barbarian groups. While such arrangements provided temporary manpower, they also introduced risks of divided loyalty. Some federated soldiers became de facto rulers in their own regions, further weakening central authority. At the same time, the empire's borders along the Rhine and Danube were under constant pressure. Germanic tribes, emboldened by population growth and seeking fertile lands, crossed into Roman territory, sometimes peacefully but increasingly through force. The Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia, pushed westward, displacing other tribes and indirectly causing a cascade of migrations that would bring thousands of people into the empire's heartlands. Culturally, the Western Empire was in flux. Christianity, which had been legalized and later embraced under Constantine, now dominated public and private life. Pagan traditions declined, temples fell into disuse, and clergy increasingly assumed roles in civic administration. This transformation provided some unity in the form of shared faith, yet it also altered traditional Roman identity, creating tensions between the old and new orders. Local populations adapted differently, leading to a patchwork of cultural assimilation and resistance across the provinces. By the mid-5th century, these converging pressures culminated in a series of events that irrevocably altered the Western Empire. After Alaric's sack, successive waves of barbarian invasions continued. The Vandals seized North Africa, cutting off critical grain supplies. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy, and other groups carved out kingdoms from Roman territories. The empire's Western institutions, already weakened, struggled to respond. Rome itself ceased to be the effective seat of power, while emperors became figureheads under the control of military leaders or barbarian kings. The fall of the Western Empire is thus a story not of sudden collapse, but of gradual, multifaceted transformation. Political instability, economic strain, social division, and external pressure combined over centuries to erode the structures that once seemed eternal. The empire's endurance in the East, its cultural and legal legacies, and the survival of its ideas remind us that the fall of Rome was not an end in totality, but a passage into a new historical reality. In contemplating this story, we are invited to see history as a continuum, shaped by slow pressures and sudden shocks, by human ambition and circumstance, by resilience and fragility alike. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event, but a long, gradual process. By the 5th century CE, political authority in the West had crumbled under the weight of external invasions, internal strife, and economic decline. The story of Rome's fall, often dramatized as barbarian hordes storming the Eternal City, is far more intricate and fascinating. In truth, Rome's influence persisted, not only in surviving cities and infrastructure, but in law, culture, religion, and the very identity of the peoples who inhabited its former provinces. To understand the full extent of Rome's legacy, one must examine how its political structures adapted, how barbarian rulers incorporated Roman systems, and how the Eastern Empire preserved the empire's traditions for centuries to come. After the sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric and the Visigoths, the Western Empire never fully recovered. Its political center weakened, with emperors increasingly dependent on powerful generals or barbarian kings. For instance, Ricimer, a Germanic general, controlled succession and manipulated imperial appointments, effectively making emperors figureheads. Such arrangements underscored the shift from centralized Roman authority to a hybrid system in which military power determined governance. At the same time, local Roman elites retained significant influence over cities, administration, and justice. In many ways, they acted as a bridge between the old empire and the new barbarian-led kingdoms, preserving Roman legal practices, tax collection, and civic administration even as the overarching imperial structure dissolved. Barbarian kingdoms in the West adopted Roman models selectively. The Visigoths in Hispania retained Roman administrative frameworks while blending them with their own tribal customs. Ostrogothic Italy, under Theodoric, is another example. Cities maintained Roman municipal governments, courts continued to operate under Roman law, and Latin remained the language of administration. Even the Vandals in North Africa, despite initial disruption, recognized that effective governance required the preservation of Roman bureaucratic systems. The ability of barbarian rulers to integrate Roman institutions highlights a critical point. Rome's fall was less about the disappearance of civilization and more about its transformation. Economically, the collapse of central authority in the West led to a reorganization rather than total ruin. Trade networks shifted from Mediterranean-wide exchanges to more localized systems. The loss of North African grain supply forced cities to depend more on local production. Urban centers shrank in population but retained key infrastructure, such as roads, aqueducts, and ports, allowing commerce to continue on a smaller scale. Villages and rural estates became self-sufficient, producing both food and artisanal goods. Taxation persisted, but was often administered by local elites or barbarian rulers, highlighting the continuation of Roman economic practices even in a politically fragmented landscape. Cultural life also transformed without disappearing. Christianity, now firmly established, provided continuity across diverse populations. Bishops and clergy often assumed civic roles, acting as judges, administrators, and mediators. Monastic communities preserved literacy, copied texts, and safeguarded philosophical, legal, and religious works, ensuring that knowledge survived despite political fragmentation. Pagan traditions declined, but elements of Roman culture, from public architecture to festivals, continued in adapted forms. This blending blending of Roman and barbarian traditions produced hybrid societies that were both new and recognizable. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, preserved Roman governance, military structure, and cultural identity. Constantinople, fortified with massive walls, remained the empire's center of political power, trade, and culture. Eastern emperors maintained a centralized bureaucracy capable of responding to external threats such as the Sasanian Persians, Slavs, and later emerging Islamic powers. Roman law was codified and refined, most famously under Justinian, whose corpus juris civilis would influence European legal systems for centuries. The East also retained Roman architectural traditions, monumental art, and military strategies, demonstrating that Rome's essence persisted even as the Western Empire disintegrated. Social identity during this transitional period became complex. In the West, Roman gradually shifted from a political label to a cultural and legal identity. Barbarian rulers often adopted Roman titles, maintained Roman cities, and used Latin in governance. The fusion of Roman and barbarian elements shaped medieval European societies, influencing language, law, and political organization. Meanwhile, in the East, citizens still considered themselves Romans, though Hellenistic culture and Orthodox Christianity gradually shaped Byzantine identity. Across Europe, the Roman legacy persisted in law, literacy, urban planning, and infrastructure, proving that civilization endures through adaptation. Daily life in post-Roman Europe illustrates these changes vividly. Cities contracted but retained essential structures. Forums, baths, amphitheaters, and churches provided civic and cultural hubs. Rural populations relied on villas and estates producing food and craft goods. Trade continued along roads built by Roman engineers, linking towns and regions. Education, though limited, persisted through monasteries and clergy. Roman customs, architecture, and legal practices were adapted by both Roman elites and barbarian rulers, demonstrating continuity in everyday life despite the collapse of imperial authority. Military structures also adapted. Barbarian armies incorporated Roman training, discipline, and strategies, while the East maintained professional legions to defend borders. Federated troops in the West often served as both military and administrative agents, blending Roman and tribal practices. These hybrid military systems allowed some stability, even in politically fragmented regions, and ensured that Roman military knowledge influenced medieval warfare. Religiously, Christianity played a unifying role. The Church provided governance, education, and social services. Bishops became civic leaders, arbitrators, and record keepers. Monks preserved manuscripts, histories, and legal codes, forming a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages. Pagan traditions declined but persisted in folklore, local festivals, and architectural motifs. The synthesis of Roman civic traditions and Christian authority shaped the emerging medieval world, illustrating continuity amid transformation. In the long view, Rome's fall in the West was less an abrupt catastrophe and more a gradual evolution. Political authority shifted to barbarian kings, but Roman law, infrastructure, culture, and religion endured. The Eastern Empire preserved the Roman state, bridging the ancient and medieval worlds. This dual legacy, transformation in the West, continuity in the East, highlights a profound lesson. Civilizations adapt, endure, and transform, rather than disappearing entirely. Rome's story is one of resilience, demonstrating that even in apparent decline, ideas, institutions, and cultural practices can survive, shape future generations, and leave a lasting imprint on the world. As the Western Roman Empire dissolved, the political landscape of Europe underwent profound transformation. Rome's administrative machinery, once centralized and uniform, fragmented into a mosaic of barbarian-led kingdoms. Yet, amid this apparent chaos, the enduring influence of Roman systems remained evident. In regions ruled by the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks, Roman law, urban structures, taxation systems, and civic customs were often preserved, albeit adapted to fit the needs of new rulers. These hybrid societies became the foundation for medieval Europe. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric illustrates this adaptation. Theodoric, a Gothic king ruling a primarily Roman population, maintained Roman bureaucrats in positions of authority, upheld Roman legal traditions, and allowed cities to govern local affairs according adapting to Roman customs. The fusion of Gothic leadership and Roman administration produced a relatively stable state that, while militarily focused, retained essential elements of Roman civic life. Similarly, in Hispania, the Visigoths adopted Roman municipal structures and law codes, demonstrating that barbarian conquest did not obliterate Roman systems, but transformed them. In Gaul, the rise of the Franks marked a significant shift. Clovis, the Merovingian king, embraced Roman political and religious frameworks, converting to Christianity and using the church to legitimize his authority. Roman law influenced Frankish legal codes, while urban centers retained Roman administrative functions. Even in regions devastated by warfare, the underlying framework of Roman governance, including taxation, record-keeping, and civic organization, persisted. Local elites, often of Roman descent, continued to act as intermediaries between rulers and populations, ensuring continuity amid political upheaval. Economically, the collapse of centralized Western authority required adaptation. Trade networks shrank, and cities became less reliant on long-distance commerce, focusing instead on regional markets and self-sufficient rural estates. The decline of the Roman Empire was not the result of a single event or a single invasion. Rather, it was a prolonged, multifaceted process that unfolded over centuries. From the height of its power in the 2nd century CE, the empire began to experience gradual strains, economic, political, military, and social, that would eventually erode its foundations. Economically, Rome faced chronic difficulties that stemmed from its dependence on conquest and plunder. The empire had expanded rapidly, but as territorial expansion slowed, the flow of spoils, slaves, and tribute that had fueled Rome's economy diminished. Agricultural productivity suffered due to overworked land and a declining labor force, while inflation increased as the state minted coins with less and less silver content. The heavy taxation imposed on Roman citizens to sustain the military and bureaucracy only added to popular resentment. Cities that had once thrived under Roman rule began to stagnate, and local economies struggled to remain self-sufficient. Politically, the empire was plagued by instability. The sheer size of the Roman state made governance difficult, with emperors often facing challenges in projecting authority across distant provinces. This weakness was compounded by a frequent turnover in leadership, particularly during the 3rd century CE, when Rome experienced a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. During these decades, emperors were frequently overthrown, assassinated, or killed in battle, sometimes after only a few months in power. Civil wars erupted repeatedly, further draining resources and weakening the empire's ability to respond to external threats. Militarily, Rome faced mounting pressure along its borders. Germanic tribes, such as the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, were increasingly aggressive, and the once disciplined Roman legions struggled to repel them. The empire's reliance on mercenary forces, often recruited from the same barbarian groups that threatened Rome, introduced a vulnerability. Loyalty was uncertain, and military discipline suffered. Key battles, such as the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE under King Alaric, shocked the Roman world and highlighted the vulnerability of the empire that had long seemed invincible. Socially, the fabric of Roman society was also fraying. A widening gap between the wealthy elite and the poor contributed to social unrest, while traditional civic values and the sense of Roman identity were eroding. The spread of Christianity introduced a new moral and cultural framework, challenging old Roman religious and civic traditions. While Christianity provided a sense of unity and spiritual purpose, it also transformed political life and loyalties in ways that some historians argue weakened traditional Roman institutions. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves under Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century was intended to make administration more manageable, but it also created long-term structural challenges. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, grew stronger and more resilient, eventually becoming the Byzantine Empire. In contrast, the Western Empire, centered in Rome and later Ravenna, faced relentless invasions, political fragmentation, and economic decline. Barbarian invasions played a decisive role in the Western Empire's collapse. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, pushed Germanic tribes into Roman territories, triggering a domino effect of migrations and conflicts. The Visigoths' entry into Roman lands, culminating in the sack of Rome in 410 CE, marked a symbolic turning point. Later, the Vandals captured North Africa, severing critical grain supplies, while the Ostrogoths and other groups carved out kingdoms in former Roman provinces. By 476 CE, when the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the Western Empire had effectively ceased to exist. Yet, it is crucial to understand that Rome did not simply vanish. Roman law, culture, and administrative practices persisted in successor states, influencing medieval European kingdoms and beyond. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman traditions for nearly 1,000 more years, maintaining legal codes, architectural achievements, and cultural continuity. Even in the West, Latin language, Christian institutions, and urban structures shaped the medieval world. Historians continue to debate the relative importance of these factors. Some emphasize internal weaknesses, political corruption, economic strain, social decay as primary causes. Others highlight external pressures, particularly the relentless invasions of migrating tribes. A growing consensus recognizes that the fall of Rome was a complex interplay of internal and external dynamics, with no single cause sufficient to explain the empire's collapse. We can hear the distant march of legions, the debates of senators, the laughter of children in the forum, and in that imagining there is a kind of solace, a reminder that even in decline there is life, even in endings there is the quiet promise of beginnings. So tonight, as you reflect on the rise and fall, the myths and realities, remember Rome not only as a story of loss, but as a story of human resilience. For even when empires fall, their ideas, their structures, and their legacy continue to ripple through time, shaping the world long after their stones have crumbled and their legions have marched away. And perhaps, as you drift into sleep, you can carry with you a sense of wonder at the endurance of history and at the quiet, inexorable passage of time, a rhythm as old and steady as the heartbeat of Rome itself.